Good day, everyone. My name is Mukhtar Raban, and I'd like to welcome you to this presentation. I'm one of the researchers in the COOL project, and this presentation will be looking at how blended learning can be used as a way to open up learning at a Tvet college in South Africa. The title of my presentation is Blending and Opening Up Learning at Northlink Tvet College. A very brief background to myself. I'm a lecturer at Nelson Mandela University, and I'm very passionate about teaching and learning. I have particular interests in language learning and teaching, technology-enhanced learning, digital humanities, and open learning. And I've presented at a few conferences. I'm doing my PhD in critical digital pedagogies at UCT, and I live in Gqeberha with my wife and 3 children. So let's look at what informed this study, what triggered this study. Firstly, we acknowledge that blended learning is increasing globally and in South Africa. Blended learning is being adopted as a pedagogical and methodological approach to learning and teaching through the strategic use of technology, complementing your face-to-face or contact teaching. In South Africa, blended learning is on an upward trajectory. We find many PSET and higher education institutions adopting blended learning as a methodology and promoting it because of its benefits in learning. Now, from a policy perspective, in 2017, the draft Open Learning Policy Framework was published, in which the DHET is calling for increased open learning. And it's critical to understand, what does open learning really mean? What does it entail? The policy argues that open learning could be realized via blended learning. Now, when we look at blended learning and how it is implemented, how it is employed in different spaces and in different ways, literature is highlighting, and more recently, possibly in the last 10 years, in the last decade, that through the strategic use of an ICT-mediated means of learning and teaching, or an ICT-mediated, mean or approach to learning and teaching, pedagogical concerns arise. In other words, we initially might have hastened to incorporate and include technology in the way we teach, in how we teach in our classrooms. There was this, rapid move to integrate ICTs into education. But the price was paid to a certain extent, in that it was found that there are pedagogical concerns. So it's important to keep that as a consideration as we explore whether blended learning is a viable option for promoting open learning. The DHET identified Northlink Tvet College as a potential leader in blended learning. And the Northlink Tvet College subsequently became the research site for this study. We also need to acknowledge that blended learning is understood to contribute to the widening of learning flexibility. And we also know that blended learning holistically aligns with the DHET's open learning principles. So the research question that was used for this study is, in what ways is blended learning opening up learning for students in a Tvet college in South Africa? The study specifically looked at, in what ways is blended learning operationalized at the college. It looked at what are some of the pedagogical approaches that are being followed under the sort of category of blended learning at the college, and also what are some of the student and staff perceptions of blended learning at the college. To very briefly look at some of the literature, we are going to explore key concepts, including open learning, blended learning in the Tvet sector, and social justice. Firstly, in exploring open learning, we know that the draft Open Learning Policy Framework that was published in 2017 calls for higher education institutions to find ways to explore open learning and essentially open up learning for students. We recognize that the DHET conceives open learning as removing barriers to access that have been created by various factors such as geographic distance from educational campuses, timetable scheduling that is possibly incompatible with people's working lives, those that have family responsibilities. These have become barriers to access. Unaffordable fees, have become a barrier to access, and also alienating pedagogic practices, lack of access to technology, lack of physical educational infrastructure, and discrimination on the basis of gender, age, race, ethnicity, social class, language, or disability. Open learning entails removing barriers to access quality learning for success. One of the principles that are mentioned in the draft Open Learning Policy Framework is that learning provision must be flexible. It must allow learners to determine when and where and what and how they learn. And it should also afford them the flexibility in terms of the pace at which they will learn. We have to acknowledge that open learning must be scalable as well as flexible. So, dear colleagues, there's an emphasis placed on the flexibility of learning when we explore what it means to open up learning. And openness, this concept of openness in open learning, has particular implications for the use of technology, according to Bates. How will we use technology to open up learning, to increase access to the learning encounter, the pedagogic encounter? These are critical questions. So open learning is frequently explored via ICT-mediated means such as blended learning. Which brings us to the concept of blended learning. Now, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with this already, blended learning is the combination of online learning and face-to-face or contact learning. And the blend essentially occurs when we join these two modalities. Now, there's limited literature on best practices for blended learning that are contextually relevant for the Tvet sector. We also acknowledge that many Tvet colleges in the country are not necessarily in a position to fully explore ICTs in education, possibly because of financial constraints. They might not be appropriately resourced, infrastructural concerns. A number of factors contribute to Tvets not being able to fully explore ICTs in education. We acknowledge as well that the lockdown, of course brought about by the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, resulted in emergency remote teaching occurring. Colleges, universities, institutions, schools had to hasten to shift to an online modality. And with the lockdown easing and limited contact teaching and learning being permitted, blended learning also proliferated in many higher education spaces. The DHET in South Africa, during this context, during the lockdown context, facilitated a shift to increased online learning through the provision of additional support. And when we explore blended learning, particularly within the Tvet context, there has to be an emphasis on the pedagogical design of the encounter. How is that encounter constructed? How is it conceptualized? How is it planned? What principles are taken into consideration when we want to implement a blended learning encounter? This brings us to the final concept of social justice. So what does social justice have to do with open learning and blended learning? Well, firstly, when we look at the way DHET conceives open learning with a focus on issues of access, success, student success, flexibility of learning, the removal of barriers, we then undeniably find that open learning has an implicit social justice intent. And what is social justice? We turn to the works of Nancy Fraser, in which she views social justice as being parity of participation, in which she views that in order for social justice to come about, individuals or social actors need to be able to participate equally in social life in order for social justice to occur. And Fraser views social justice via the trivalent lens, the three dimensions of economic, cultural, and political justice. Economic justice would entail that parties are appropriately resourced to fully engage in the encounter in social life. From a cultural perspective, Fraser views that for cultural justice to occur, individuals' backgrounds, languages, ethnicities, knowledges all have to be recognized equally and respected in order for social justice to occur. And politically, it is important that all social actors have their voices heard, that they have a say, and that they have a seat at the table. So when these three areas or dimensions are met, then we can declare that social justice is occurring. Now, when we combine social justice with the area of ICTs in education, we find that the introduction of ICTs in education and ICT-mediated means to teaching and learning, or an ICT-mediated approach to teaching and learning, it's important to acknowledge that such an introduction should not harm the goals of social justice. In other words, that we should not necessarily roll out e-learning or blended learning under the banner of open learning, but then it harms the goals of social justice. That would be counterintuitive. There are very useful principles that can be followed when one wishes to foster social justice in a blended learning offering. And I just want to touch on a few of them. Firstly, when you offer a course or a module in accordance with a blended learning modality, and you want this to be socially just, then the encounter must foster community and interpersonal relationships among students and teachers, lecturers, facilitators. We should also seek to create an inclusive learning environment that is adaptable, that is flexible, that accommodates diverse learning preferences, diverse learning styles, and includes varying social identities. It must emphasize dialogue. It should promote the model of dialogic inclusive participation. It must provide for an exploration of social identities so that students can understand how these identities are situated within systems of power and privilege. So these principles may be considered when we want to evaluate if a blended learning offering is fulfilling social justice principles. The framework of this study basically brings all of these concepts together. In exploring open learning, we cannot ignore the firm social justice underpinning. And so, seeing that the draft open learning policy framework recommends that blended learning could be a vehicle for exploring open learning, we then need to consider what are the social justice implications for offering blended learning. How are the social justice concerns of students taken into consideration when it comes to the pedagogical designing of the blended learning encounter? The methodology that was followed for this case study is that we adhered to the qualitative paradigm. Our research tools for gathering data included online interviews with the manager of the education and training unit at Northlink College. We also had online interviews with 2 lecturers from the college, and a focus group was conducted with 6 students at Northlink Tvet College in Cape Town. The college has 7 campuses and about 18,000 students. The data was collected and qualitatively analyzed, exploring thematic analysis via 3 areas or 3 layers as well. We looked at the operationalization of blended learning. We looked at the pedagogical designs of the encounters, as well as what are the social justice underpinnings for these encounters and processes. Let's get to the findings of the study. So the study found that Northlink Tvet College in Cape Town broadly employs a sound strategy in operationalizing and employing blended learning. One of the research participants shared the motto that they have, that no student or staff member left behind. This is really important from an inclusivity perspective that is critical when exploring social justice intent. In exploring the perceptions of staff and students concerning blended learning, we find that the staff held overwhelmingly positive views of blended learning. With students, they shared that they supported blended learning, but they prefer more face-to-face learning as opposed to online learning. When looking at the operationalization of blended learning at Northlink, some of the mechanisms that they have in place and they are following include that they established an education and training unit that oversees blended learning and online learning at the college. They also established a digital learning committee that is fairly representative, including representatives from staff, students, and management. The education and training unit worked really hard to provide training and support opportunities to staff. The education and training unit produced resources, video resources, to facilitate the move to learning in the online space. The college also has what they call a Moodle framework, which is hierarchical in structure, that basically allows for staff to determine where they can obtains support, and it also allows for a line of reporting within the college structures to ensure that the college moves as a collective and progresses in terms of the employment of blended learning. The college also engaged, particularly the teaching staff, engaged in the sharing of best practices in staff meetings as a regular inclusion. The college also established open learning centers, an open learning center on each campus that provides access to computers and for students, as well as support for their online learning. The college is very particular on the use of WhatsApp as a tool for communication, for facilitated communication, to ensure that they are able to engage with students quite easily. And the college has a functional learning management system in place. Now, exploring the perceptions and the operationalization of blended learning at the college, there are a few areas or points that come to mind when we use the social justice lens. Firstly, from an economic perspective, we find that immediate responses were provided via the provision of Wi-Fi and the open learning centers and the functional LMS and the use of WhatsApp. In terms of an economic concern, is that students shared that they have insufficient data to access the online learning as part of the blended learning modality. Students also shared that they have limited devices, personal devices, and also access to devices was limited to the operational hours of the open learning centers, as many students have to take public transport to get home, and as such, they have to leave campus a bit earlier. From a cultural perspective, the study found that training and support to staff are culturally recognizing. It affords staff with a background to engaging in blended learning. And the study found that lecturers design with students' backgrounds being considered. The lecturers shared that they considered the demographics of the students as they chose specific material and resources, with the intention that students can relate to it. The lecturers shared that many students also cited that they could not or did not relate to some of the material because it was not produced locally. And so there's misrecognition that occurs because of limited, locally produced online resources. Students shared that they did not receive sufficient training and support to fully engage with online learning, which then possibly justifies why the participants indicated that they prefer more face-to-face as opposed to the online components. From a political perspective, we found that the way in which the college approaches blended learning is particularly representative for staff, but to a certain extent misframing for students. That students are not completely represented and included in the decision-making processes that govern blended learning and its employment in the college. From a political perspective as well, the study found that DHET policies limit the way blended learning may be employed and taken up, because the participant shared that there is still a requirement for assignments, for assessments to be printed and moderated on paper, and so a transformative response to that is required by having a policy change. We can conclude that the college's approaches to blended learning can be seen broadly as a way of opening up learning. Some of the recommendations that emanate from the study include for the college, that the college should provide additional support and training for students in particular, and incorporate multilingual practices in the online learning areas specifically, as this was cited by the student participants as lacking. A recommendation for NSFAS is that they need to consider the financial needs of students, particularly from the perspective of device and data access. And a recommendation for DHET is that they should revisit policies that possibly constrain completely online assessment and moderation practices. Thank you so much for your time. I'd like to thank the participants from Northlink Tvet College in Cape Town for their engagement and cooperation and their warmth, and also a big thank you to the COOL project mentors and team for their support and guidance. Beloved colleagues, thank you so much for joining me in this presentation. To conclude, this presentation looked at how blended learning as operationalized and offered by Northlink Tvet College subscribes to open learning principles, and whether there is a social justice intent being realized in the offering. Thank you so much.